Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here, and as an American coming to Canada, thank you for having me here. I've always felt a special connection. I did my first 2 years of college at McGill. I've come up to Canada many, many times, to Vancouver and Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, on drug policy. And I'll also say that not so long ago, we would look north and point to you guys as role models. But then you elected this guy. And he started advocating for mandatory minimum sentences of the sort that our most hardcore right-wing Republicans were rejecting. And I said, Canada's in trouble. You guys are in trouble. But I'll also tell you this, when people ask me what's going to be the next country that votes to legalize, that moves to legalize and legally regulate marijuana after Uruguay, which looks like it's going to do it shortly, and my response is probably Canada. You know, your public split about 50-50 on this issue. And, you know, once this guy's out, the other guys are in, I think there's a decent chance that you guys may be next. So let me try to frame this stuff for you, and not just talk about marijuana. I'll do marijuana, but also doing the whole bigger picture as well, and as much as I can in 15 minutes. And by the time I'm finished, I'll be speaking twice as fast as I am now. I am, as an American activist, shaped, of course, by what's happening in my own country. I have to live with the shame of living in a country which has less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. A country which leads the world in per capita incarceration rates, one which has the highest incarceration rate of any democratic society in history, and one which locks up men of color, and especially black men, at rates that grossly exceed the rates of incarceration in apartheid South Africa, or even the Soviet gulags of the mid-20th century. So that's something that I live with, and the fact that even things that you move forward with it on harm reduction around needle exchange, things like that, we have lagged and been slow to do that sort of thing. Then again, I remember a friend and one of the leading Canadian criminologists working in this area, Patricia Erickson, University of Toronto. I don't know if it was her line or she was quoting somebody else saying, you know, Ethan, she said, the truth about Canada is our bite is worse than our bark. By which she meant, we seem like we're mellow and not all that severe on things, but if you actually look at the data and the statistics and arrest levels and such, we are far behind the US, but in some respects a lot closer to you than we are to Europe. So don't be deceived by your own self-image of Canadian, you know, not so much, you're not known for live and let live, but for being kind of, you know, moderate on these things. Things are actually relatively harsh here, notwithstanding the admirable innovations that Michelle was talking about before. So the next thing I want to say is, as an audience and a group of scientists, let's remember that when we're thinking about change, the interesting question to ask is, where does the burden of proof lie? Where does the burden, should in fact even on a, not this is so much of a debate, but should it be the burden of proof on those who advocate for change or on those who want to defend the status quo? Well, if the status quo policies were all grounded in science and evidence, one might say, well, status quo gets the edge here. Those who want change, you know, they have to make the case. But in point of fact, if you ask, what are the origins of prohibitionist laws in my country and to a good extent in your country and many others around the world? You know, if you ask the question, was there a moment at which something like the National Academy of Sciences in my country or the equivalent in your country got together 80, 90, 100 years ago, looked at all the evidence, came to the conclusion, well, alcohol and cigarettes, you know, we'll legally regulate them, and these other ones, you know, marijuana, cocaine, or whatever, those will be prohibited? No. And if you ask the question, well, how did we evolve from a kind of free market and semi-regulatory system in the late 19th century to the prohibitionist system in the 20th century? And there are a whole range of variables, but what you see historically in your country and mine and many others is that the number one variable that determined which drugs were treated as a health issue and which as a criminal issue had relatively little to do with the respective risks and dangers of the individual substances, and much more to do with who used and who was perceived to use those substances. Who were the principal opiate consumers in North America in the 1870s and 80s? Middle-aged white women. They didn't have stuff, people going through menopause, dealing with aches and pains. There was no aspirin, there was no penicillin, diarrhea was rampant, opiates stop you up, there's a sal. Millions of people at higher rates than we have today used opiates, the liquid laudanum form, and all this. Some got addicted, some it was a problem, right? But by and large, oftentimes people consuming this stuff didn't even know they were addicted to it any more than people know they're addicted to coffee today, until somehow you can't find it or can't get it. Right? And nobody proposed criminalizing the opiates back then. Why? Because nobody wanted to put grandma or auntie behind bars. Right? But when the Chinese start coming to North America and taking those jobs on the railroads and the mines and all this and working 80 to 100 hours a week, hard conditions, going back to their dormitories or tents, smoking up that little opium like they did in the old country and like their parents and grandparents did, and going back to work the next day, that's when you got the first calls for prohibitionist laws. In my country, California and Nevada, in the 1870s and 80s, the fear of the Chinaman and what he would do with his opium dens, luring and addicting our precious white women into these places of iniquity. The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South of the United States in the early 20th century, directed at black men. The fear, what would these black men do when they put this white powder up their black noses and forgot who they were? Police departments saying we need to go from a 38 to a 45 because the word is you can't bring down a Negro crazed on cocaine with a 38. That was in the New York Times, by the way. I mean, if we look at where these myths went, the paper of record in my country, right? The first anti-marijuana laws, marijuana prohibition laws in my country, the Midwest and Southwest, right? Directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans coming up into our country, taking good jobs from good white people, going back, smoking up a little reefer, la cucaracha, right? Yeah. And that's when we got the prohibitions. Even alcohol prohibition to some extent, right, was to some extent a conflict between the white Americans and the not so white Americans, right? Between the white Americans coming from Northern and Western Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century with their alcohol, and the not so white Americans coming from Southern Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, flooding into our country, my country, maybe your country to some extent, and bringing with them their beer and their vino and their Schlivowitz, right? It was that sort of fear about who used. And if you look around the rest of the world, oftentimes countries signing on to these new international conventions throughout the 20th century. Prohibition on cannabis? Oh, okay, we don't even know what it is, but why not? Somebody else is asking us to do this. So the status quo policy and the status quo laws are not something that inherently deserve our deference. In fact, the obligation, I believe, as scientists and as people who want a moral drug control policy is to step back and to ask, what is the best way to deal with the reality of psychoactive drugs in our society, both the ones that grow out of the ground and the ones created in both legal and illegal laboratories? What is the best way? Well, the question then becomes, what do you mean by the best way? And I'd say, I would define the best drug control policy as that which accomplishes two things. First, it seeks to reduce the negative consequences of drug use in our society, addiction, disease, suffering, death, crime, all of those things. And secondly, it seeks to reduce the negative consequences of the government's drug control policies, the crime, violence, corruption, black markets, adulterated drugs, wasted expenditures, and all this sort of thing. That the ideal drug policy is the one which most successfully minimizes the harms of drugs and the harms of government policies, and we need to find the right medium there. Okay, how do you think about that then? Well, let me suggest this, because this debate about legalization or prohibition is kind of like a ping pong in a way, and ultimately it's helpful in some respects but not in others. So think about instead the array of drug control options along a continuum, from the most punitive at one end to the most free market, libertarian, Milton Friedman's wet dream over here, right? So at one end you got Saudi Arabia and Singapore, and chop off their fingers, hang them up by their necks, drug test them randomly on the streets, throw them into camps, whip them, you name it. And at the other end, something like the alcohol or tobacco policies of the 1960s or something like that, right? Relatively free market, minimal controls on kids, right? And now imagine if what we're trying to do is to find the spot on this continuum that most successfully reduces the harms of drugs and the harms of drug policies, right? That tries to pull back on the prohibitionist excesses. That tries, on the other hand, to impose all sorts of controls on time and place of consumption and of sale and of taxations and the things that we've been doing with tobacco over the last 30 years. But over here, trying to pull back on the criminal sanctions and trying to come into some reasonable middle ground over here, someplace over here. If I had to define the objective of what I do and have done for many years as an activist in the US and around the world, a drug policy reform activist, I'd say that what we seek to do is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with protecting public health and safety. We seek to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with public health and safety. Moving it down this spectrum, down this way, someplace over here, as much as possible, but stopping short of the point where somehow we avoid the massive jumps in addiction and problems and things like that, right? My struggle, being a drug policy reform activist, is uniting a group of people that range from libertarian, legalize it all people over here, to those who don't really want to legalize anything, or maybe just marijuana, but think we should get rid of all the drug roll and hyper-punitiveness, and keeping that coalition together so that we can try to end the drug war in my country, yours, and many others. That's the objective. So the question becomes, why even think about legalization, especially apart from marijuana? I mean, marijuana legalization in my country, the momentum is extraordinary. Line up the polls with legalization of gay marriage, and they line up almost identically over the last 7 years. In your country, it's pretty close to my country, and I think it could well happen here. It's going to probably happen in Uruguay in the next couple of months, and other countries in Europe's beginning to move more in that direction again and all that. But for those who think there's a slippery slope from legalizing marijuana to legalizing other drugs, I don't see it. The Dutch have had a quasi-legal regulation of marijuana for 40 years. There's no big support for legalizing the other drugs, right? In America, support for legalizing marijuana has gone up like that. Support for legalizing other drugs is under 15%, maybe 20%. I ask the question. So there's no slippery slope there. What's the value then for even thinking about legalization? And by legalization, I mean legally regulating a drug more or less like alcohol or cigarettes. That's my definition of legalization. And just to quibble one little point, when Michel said, he described the argument of Larry as kind of, getting rid of regulations, reducing regulation. And I say, no, wait a second. Legalization equals legal regulation. Prohibition represents the abdication of regulation. What you prohibit means you abdicate any control over whatever remains in the market. So by legalization doesn't mean free-for-all, it means legal regulation, right? But there's 3 reasons to think about legalization itself. The first one is, when you lay out that model, what it does is it clarifies intellectually and in the public mind the distinction between the harms of the drug and the harms of prohibition. It's what enabled us to repeal alcohol prohibition in my country in 1933, because people distinguished between the horrors of alcohol addiction on the one hand, and the horrors of alcohol prohibition, Al Capone, organized crime, violence and corruption, black markets, young people looking up to alcohol dealers as bootleggers, as role models, adulterated booze, killing and poisoning hundreds of thousands of people. They understood. One's the harms of alcohol, the other is the harms of the prohibitionist policy, right? So that's the first reason. The second reason it's important to put that legalization thing out there, not politically, but in a place like this, is because it forces us to ask ourselves, what is it that scares us about legalization? What is it? Why do we fear the notion that somehow these other more potent drugs, heroin, opiates, cocaine, stimulants, would be available? It asks us deep down to ask, what kind of society are we? What kind of human beings are we? What do we really fear? And I'll tell you deep down, the real deep down difference between those of us in the middle of this debate, the prohibitionists and the non-prohibitionists, is that deep down there are people who believe that if somehow we move to a legal regulatory system, that the number of addicts in your country and mine would increase 5 and 10-fold, right? That potential lies within our societies, that Sodom and Gomorrah is hanging around the corner if we go that way. And on the other hand is a view that says, how much? Yeah. Two more. Is a view that basically says, wait a second. We live in a world of widely available substances. All sorts of other things are addictive out there. There are, in fact, risks we can take. Now, just to conclude over here, on marijuana, here's what I basically think. What I'm fighting for also is that the next generation will look back on marijuana prohibition today and ask, like we now ask about alcohol prohibition in the 20s, what was that all about? Maybe marijuana use will go up, maybe down. I think it'll probably go up among older people, stay the same among younger people, but it's like, come on already. This drug is not killing people. Let's legally regulate it, be responsible, and do so in another way. What I regret that I did not have time to talk about, so I'll just finish it in this, is that the two other elements, apart from marijuana, one is the issue of decriminalization, where I disagree with both of my predecessors right here. Ultimately, a policy of decriminalizing the possession, of legalizing the possession while keeping the wholesale production distribution illegal may be hypocritical, but I prefer a hypocritical policy that does less harm to a coherent policy that does more harm. And it means that the model in Portugal, as opposed to the model in North America, the model in Portugal, which basically says, sorry, we're not going to put you in jail for drug possession. We just don't do that. As opposed to the model in North America, which says, if you got drugs, we'll give you a couple of chances to get clean, but ultimately, we got to lock you up if you don't stop. And thirdly, the bigger issue we got to deal with, because we're not going to legalize more broadly anytime in any foreseeable future, what's happening in Mexico, Afghanistan, Latin America, the Caribbean, West Africa, with powerful criminal organizations and an international black market worth hundreds of billions of dollars, we all have some obligation one way or another not to ignore that. And legalizing marijuana or decriminalizing possession only solves a small part of that problem. Ultimately, we need to find a way to deal with that, and I believe ultimately the answer to that is we're going to need to come up with the systems that allow those people who are determined to get their drugs no matter what. They'll get it legally, they'll get it illegally. We need to figure out the way to allow those people to get their drugs from a legal source without making it broadly available to everywhere. It means taking Marty's Naomi and Salome heroin maintenance programs and things like that and figuring out creatively the ways to scale those up in a meaningful way to undercut the black markets and the violence that are proving so devastating around the world. Thank you very much.